The man who rode into Dusty Creek on the morning of April 3, 1882, had a name that most folks in the Arizona Territory had learned to either respect or fear, and Samuel Shelby had long since stopped caring which one applied. He came in on a roan horse named Copper, a steady animal with a white blaze down its nose, and the kind of calm temperament that suited a man who made his living tracking people who did not want to be found. Samuel was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar from the dust and the wind. His jaw held 2 days of stubble, and his eyes were a particular shade of gray that people tended to remember, not because they were unusual in color, but because of what lived behind them. A kind of quiet watchfulness, like a hawk resting on a fence post, perfectly still but never truly at rest. He had ridden 4 days out of Tucson with a name written on a folded piece of paper tucked inside the breast pocket of his coat, and a sum of money deposited at the merchant's bank back in the city, with instructions that the remainder would be paid upon his return with the woman. The name on the paper was Sallie Alden. He did not know her. He had not bothered to ask too many questions about her, which was sometimes the way with this kind of work. A man had come to his office, if it could be called that, a rented room above a hardware store with a single desk and a window that faced the alleyway, and the man had been well-dressed, the kind of well-dressed that came with money, and not just a good tailor. He had silver cufflinks and a watch chain that caught the afternoon light. He had told Samuel that a young woman had left a household in Tucson without permission and had traveled north, and that she needed to be brought back quietly and without fuss, and that the matter was delicate in nature. Samuel had asked if she was a criminal. The man had said no. Samuel had asked if she was in danger. The man had paused in a way Samuel had noted but not yet examined closely, and then said that she was in danger of making a very serious mistake. That was the kind of answer that could mean almost anything, and Samuel had taken the job because the money was good, and because he was, in that particular spring of 1882, between reliable employment and the rent on the room above the hardware store was 3 weeks overdue. He was a tracker and a finder of people, had worked occasionally for the Pinkerton agency though never as a full agent, and had built a quiet reputation as a man who could locate someone who had gone to ground and persuade them, through reason or circumstance, to come back to wherever they were supposed to be. He had not always loved the work. There had been times when he'd found someone and looked into their face and understood in an immediate and bone-deep way that whoever had sent him was not acting in the interest of the person he had found. Those times had cost him sleep. But he had told himself, as men often tell themselves such things, that it was not his business to judge the arrangements of other people's lives. He found them. He brought them back. What happened after was not his concern. He was beginning, even before he tied Copper to the post outside the general store in Dusty Creek, to suspect that this particular job might be the one that finally broke that habit of telling himself such convenient lies. Dusty Creek was a small settlement that had grown up along a dry creek bed that only ran with water in the rainy season, and even then ran reluctantly. There were perhaps 200 people living in or around it, a mix of ranching families, a few miners who worked a copper operation 6 miles east, a blacksmith, a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Red Lantern, a small white church that tilted slightly to the left as though listening to something no one else could hear, and a doctor's house that doubled as a medical office. The doctor's name was Harlan Price, and Samuel had learned in Tucson that this was where Sallie Alden had come. He had learned, through the kind of careful and methodical inquiry that was the actual labor behind his reputation, that she had traveled by stage to Maricopa, and then north by horse, and that she had arrived in Dusty Creek approximately 3 weeks before Samuel rode in. He had learned that she had taken a position helping the doctor, as she apparently had some training or experience in nursing, though where she had acquired it was something the man in the silver cufflinks had not told him. He dismounted from Copper and stood for a moment in the middle of the road, which was not so much a road as a wide track of packed earth with wagon ruts deep enough to twist an ankle in. The sun was already warm despite the morning hour, and the air smelled of dust and wood smoke, and faintly, of something blooming out in the scrub beyond the town's edge. He went first to the general store to buy provisions and to listen, because general stores in small towns were the closest thing the frontier had to a newspaper. The man behind the counter was heavyset with a spectacular mustache, and the name Burl Deacon on the wooden sign above his door. He was willing to talk, as storekeepers generally were, and Samuel bought coffee and dried beans and a sack of oats for Copper, and let the conversation find its own direction. New to the area? Burl asked, and it was not really a question. Passing through, Samuel said, which was the standard answer. Lot of folks pass through lately, though most of them end up staying a while. Burl wrapped the coffee in brown paper and tied it with string. You looking for work, because Horace Canning out at the Double C is always short a hand this time of year. I appreciate that, Samuel said. Actually, I'm trying to locate a friend of mine, woman named Sallie Alden. I heard she came through this way a few weeks back. Burl's expression did something complicated. It was the kind of expression that people get when they know the answer to a question, but are deciding whether the person asking has any business knowing it. Samuel had learned to read that expression the way a sailor reads the sky. I might know the name, Burl said carefully. She's a friend, Samuel said again, keeping his tone easy and open. Family's been worried about her. Her brother asked me to look in on her. This was not exactly the truth. The man with the silver cufflinks had not said he was her brother. He had not said who he was at all, now that Samuel thought about it. He had said he represented interested parties. Samuel filed that thought away and kept his expression pleasant. She's been helping Doc Price, Burl said, making his decision. Good with the patients. Folks around here have taken a liking to her. He paused again. She seems settled, like she's got plans to stay. That's good to hear, Samuel said. I'll just ride over and say hello. He paid for his supplies, loaded them into his saddlebag, and rode Copper toward the far end of the settlement where the doctor's house stood behind a modest fence of wooden posts. There were flowers beginning in the small yard in front, the kind of small and determined flowers that grew in dry places, their color vivid against the dust. He knocked on the door. The woman who opened it was not who he had expected, though he could not have said exactly who he had expected. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pinned up but not quite containing itself, several strands escaping to frame a face that was composed and direct and held a kind of intelligence in the expression that made him feel, in an odd and unexpected way, like he was the one being evaluated. Her eyes were brown with flecks of amber that caught the light, and she was wearing a plain gray dress with an apron over it that had a small blood stain on the edge that was either old or from recent work. She was not delicate-looking. She was the kind of person who looked like they had decided a long time ago to be capable and had built their life accordingly. "Can I help you?" She said. "I'm looking for Miss Sallie Alden," Samuel said. There was a beat, a half-second of something moving across her face, and then she said, "Who's asking?" "My name is Samuel Shelby. I was sent by—" He stopped. And in that moment, standing in the morning sun on the front step of a doctor's house in Dusty Creek, Arizona Territory, something entirely strange happened to Samuel Shelby. He could not remember who had sent him. He stood there for 3 full seconds, which felt considerably longer, while the woman watched him with those amber-flecked eyes. The name, the man in the silver cufflinks. He had a clear image of the cufflinks, of the watch chain, of the room above the hardware store and the slant of afternoon light. He remembered taking the job. He remembered the money. He remembered riding 4 days through the desert. He could not recall the man's name. He could not recall who the man had said he was. He could not recall any precise identifying detail beyond the cufflinks and the general impression of money and urgency. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I apologize. I've ridden a fair distance and I'm—" He stopped again because he didn't have a good way to finish that sentence. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she said, "You look like you could use some water. Come around to the back." He followed her around the side of the house to where a pump stood over a stone basin in the yard. She worked the handle and water came up, cold and clean, and he drank from his cupped hands and splashed some on his face, and she waited with a patience that seemed neither anxious nor indifferent. "You are Samuel Shelby," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I am. And you were sent to find me." He looked at her. He did not try to lie because she had said it so plainly that a lie would have been an insult to them both. "Yes," he said. "By whom?" He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment. The memory was genuinely absent, like a page torn from a book. He had the binding, the context, the before and after, but the page itself was gone. "I'm having some difficulty with that particular detail at this moment." She studied him with a look that was partly skeptical and partly something else, something that might have been a guarded and tentative interest. "You're a tracker," she said, "a finder of people." "Yes. And you found me." "Yes. And you don't know who paid you to do it." He exhaled slowly. "I know that I was paid. I know the sum. I know the terms. I know I rode north out of Tucson and tracked you to this town. I cannot currently recall the name or clear description of the person who hired me." Sallie Alden was quiet for a moment. A bird was calling somewhere out in the scrub, a sharp three-note call that repeated and then stopped. "Might be a blessing," she said finally, and there was something dry in it, almost humor, though it hadn't quite decided to become humor yet. "Because whoever sent you is not someone I'd care to go back to." "Would you tell me," he said, "who you think might have sent me?" She looked at him for a long time, and he had the feeling that she was doing exactly what he did when he was deciding whether or not to trust a piece of information, weighing it, turning it over, checking its edges for deception. "Not yet," she said. "Are you hungry?" He was. He had been riding since before dawn and had eaten nothing but a strip of dried beef that he would not call adequate under any honest accounting. He said he was, and she brought him inside to a small, clean kitchen with a scrubbed wooden table, and she made him eggs and cornbread and black coffee, and Dr. Harlan Price came in from the back room where he had apparently been sleeping, having attended a difficult birth the night before that had gone until nearly 3 in the morning. Price was a man of perhaps 50, spare and weathered, with the careful, steady hands of someone who had spent decades making small, precise movements that mattered. He shook Samuel's hand and sat down with his own coffee and did not ask who he was with any apparent anxiety, which told Samuel something about either the man's character or his trust in Sallie's judgment, or possibly both. "You'll stay a day or two," Price said, as though it had already been decided. "The livery can keep your horse. Mrs. Callahan takes boarders 2 houses down." Samuel said he appreciated the offer and ate his eggs, and while he ate he watched Sallie move around the kitchen with a competence that was obviously second nature, and he tried again to locate the memory of the man in the silver cufflinks and found only that same blank place, clean and cool as the water from the pump. He told himself it would come back. Memories didn't just vanish. He had not hit his head. He had not been ill. He was not given to confusion. It would come back, and when it did, he would have to make a decision about what to do with it. And that decision was already beginning to form at the back of his mind with a weight and complexity that told him it was not going to be a simple one. He stayed at Mrs. Callahan's boarding house, a tidy woman with a sharp tongue and excellent biscuits, and he spent the first afternoon walking the town at a measured pace, doing the thing he did best, which was observing without appearing to observe. He noted the layout of the settlement, the people in it, the rhythms of the day. He noted the way people responded to Sallie when she passed, the genuine warmth of it, the way old Mr. Hennessy, who sat on the general store porch each afternoon, lifted his hat to her, the way the 2 Beaumont children who lived at the end of the main track ran to her side when she was near. She had been here 3 weeks, and she had become, in some organic and unrehearsed way, part of the place. He sat in the Red Lantern that evening with a beer he drank slowly, and a hand of cards he played badly on purpose, because people talked more freely when they thought they were winning, and he listened to the talk of Dusty Creek, and he learned several things. He learned that the copper operation east of town was having trouble with a management company out of Denver that was trying to take it over, and that this was a source of considerable anxiety for the 60 or so men who worked it. He learned that a family named Garrett had recently lost their youngest child to fever, and that Sally had sat with the mother through 2 nights of it, holding her hand. He learned that there was a man named Wick Farrow who came through the territory periodically, and was understood to be dangerous in the specific way that men who work for money without scruple are dangerous, and that he had been seen 2 days ago on the road south of town. That last piece of information settled into Samuel's mind with a small cold weight. The next morning he was at the doctor's house before 8, and when Sally opened the door she looked unsurprised to see him, which was either because she had expected it or because she was very good at not showing surprise. "Walk with me," she said, and she took off her apron and put on a light coat, and they walked together down the road toward the edge of town where the scrub began, the pale green of desert growth in the spring, sage and brittlebush, and the occasional tall column of a saguaro standing sentinel against the blue sky. "You stayed," she said. "I did. Is the memory still gone?" "Yes," he said, which was true. She was quiet for a dozen steps. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. "Not because I trust you entirely, because I don't yet, but because I think you're an honest man, and I think the honest part of you is in conflict with the part that took this job, and I'd rather have the conflict out in the open where we can look at it." "That seems fair," he said. "My name before I came here was Sallie Alderman," she said. "I changed the last part of it when I left. Alden seemed close enough that I wouldn't forget it was mine, but different enough that I hoped it would buy me some time." She paused. "I was engaged to a man named Carlisle Holt. His family owns significant property in Tucson. He is a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants and to having the world arrange itself according to his preferences." Samuel listened without speaking. "I broke the engagement 4 months ago," she said. "I had reasons that I consider sound and that Carlisle considers irrelevant. When I broke it, he told me calmly and in a low voice that was considerably more frightening than shouting would have been, that I would not be permitted to simply leave. That the engagement would be honored." She looked ahead at the scrub and the sky. "I left anyway. The man who came to my office," Samuel said slowly, still reaching for the memory. "He had a watch chain with a particular kind of fob on it, not a standard disc. It was in the shape of," he pressed his mind toward it, "a compass rose." Sally stopped walking. "That," she said carefully, "is the fob on the watch that Carlisle Holt has carried since his father gave it to him on his 21st birthday." They looked at each other. "I don't know if I can recover any more of it," Samuel said. "It doesn't matter," she said. "You already know enough. It was Carlisle who sent you, or someone acting for him. He wants me brought back. I won't go." She said it without heat, just the plain and settled statement of a woman who has thought this through entirely and arrived at a position she intends to hold. "I need you to understand that I am not going back. Whatever he paid you, whatever agreement you made, I am not cargo to be retrieved." "I know that," Samuel said. She studied him. "Do you?" "Yes," he said, and he meant it entirely, and something in his voice must have carried the entirety of the meaning, because she looked at him for a moment and then exhaled slowly, and some of the tension that had been living in her shoulders since the moment he first appeared at the door went somewhere else, at least partly. "There's a man called Wick Farrow," Samuel said. Her expression changed. "Yes, you know the name. He works for Carlisle on occasion, does the kind of work that Carlisle can't ask his regular people to do. He was seen south of town 2 days ago." She absorbed this. "Then Carlisle didn't rely only on you. He sent insurance." She said it with a bitterness that was quickly contained. "Of course he did." They turned back toward town, walking faster than they had gone out. The morning was bright and still, and the beauty of the desert was indifferent to whatever was moving beneath it, as beauty usually is. Over the next several days, Something began to happen between Samuel Shelby and Sallie Alden that neither of them was precisely prepared for, which was the honest truth of how it usually happened with the things that mattered most. He stayed, and he found reasons to be useful, because a man who is not useful becomes conspicuous in a small settlement, and conspicuous was not what they needed. He helped the blacksmith, whose name was Tom Ruiz, with a repair on a wagon wheel when Ruiz's assistant was sick, and he spent 2 mornings helping with the fence repair on the Beaumont family's small ranch on the edge of town. He had no particular plan beyond staying close enough to be useful and watching the road south. He and Sallie fell into a habit of the evenings. After her work with Dr. Price was done and supper had been eaten, she would sit on the front step of the doctor's house in the cooling air, and he would come and sit on the step below hers, and they would talk. The talking was the thing that undid him, though he was slow to recognize it for what it was. He had not genuinely talked, the kind that went somewhere new each time with anyone in a long while. His life since he was 20 and left the small Tennessee farm he'd grown up on had been mostly solitary. The companionship of horses and the occasional trustworthy colleague and the temporary company of whatever town he happened to be staying in. He had not been lonely exactly, because he did not have a particularly romantic idea of what he was missing. But in retrospect, he would understand that loneliness had been living in him quietly, the way certain plants live without water, contracted and waiting. She talked about the work she had done in Tucson, which had been informal nursing at a clinic run by the Methodist Church, where she had learned to stitch wounds and manage fevers and deliver babies in the cases where the doctor was too far away to reach in time. She talked about it with a matter-of-fact pride, the way someone speaks of a thing they are genuinely good at and know to be genuinely important. She talked about a woman named Estrella who had taught her more than anyone else, an older Mexican woman who had a knowledge of healing plants and medicinal practices that Sallie spoke of, with a reverence that was honest and not self-congratulatory. She did not, for several days, talk about Carlisle Holt in any depth, and Samuel did not push, because he understood that some things needed to come out in their own time, and that the best way to ruin that process was to be impatient with it. He talked about Tennessee, and about the years between Tennessee and Tucson, which had included a stint in the Army during the tail end of the Indian campaigns that he was not proud of, and said so plainly, and time working for a land surveying company in Texas, and the years of tracking and finding and returning. He talked about Copper, whom he loved with the uncomplicated affection that was sometimes easier to have for animals than for people, and she laughed at something he said about the horse's opinions regarding river crossings, and the laugh was sudden and genuine, and it hit him somewhere in the chest like a warm hand pressing flat against it. On the 4th evening she told him about Carlisle Holt in the depth that the earlier days had been building toward. "He is a specific kind of man," she said. The sky was going orange and deep rose at the horizon, and the first stars were beginning to appear above it. The kind who mistakes possession for love. He was kind to me at first. Not demonstratively kind, not warm, but attentive in a way that I mistook for caring. He noticed things, what I wore, who I spoke to. He remembered details. She paused. It took me too long to understand that the noticing was not tenderness. It was inventory. Samuel said nothing, just listened. When I began volunteering at the clinic, he objected. He said it was inappropriate for a woman in my position, meaning his position, to be handling the sick. She looked at her hands in her lap, turning them slightly. When I continued to go regardless, he stopped objecting and started appearing, coming to walk me home, coming to meet me at the door. He was never rude to Dr. Mendez or to any of the patients. He was perfectly pleasant, but his presence was a message, and the message was that this part of my life was being tolerated as a gift he could withdraw. "Did he ever?" Samuel began. "He never struck me," she said quietly. "I want to be clear about that because I know that is what people mean when they ask that question, and I know that without it, What I'm describing can seem like ingratitude or overreaction." She looked at him directly. "But there are other ways of reducing a person. He never raised a hand. He raised everything else. Expectations, surveillance, that particular quiet anger that is always your fault for provoking it. By the time I broke the engagement I had become in his presence, approximately half of what I was capable of being, and I realized that if I married him it would not be half. It would continue going, smaller and smaller, until there was nothing left that I recognized as myself." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "And your family, did they—" "My parents are both gone," she said. "I have a younger sister in New Mexico, in Albuquerque. She is married to a good man and she knows where I am. She is the only one who does." She paused. "Was the only one." "I won't take you back to him," Samuel said. "I want to be unambiguous about that." She looked at him in the last of the orange light. "I believe you. Whatever the terms of the job were," he said, "I'm formally abandoning them. Whatever money I owe back, I'll owe it back." "You might owe more than money," she said. "Carlyle does not react well to being crossed." "No," Samuel said. "I don't imagine he does." The thing with Wick Farrow resolved itself on the 6th day of Samuel's stay in Dusty Creek, and it resolved itself in the way that unpleasant things often did in the territory, which was loudly and inconveniently, and in the middle of the afternoon. Farrow rode in from the south on a gray horse that had been ridden hard and not well cared for, which told Samuel something about the kind of man he was dealing with before the man had opened his mouth. He was perhaps 40, lean in a stringy way, with flat eyes the color of creek mud, and the kind of patience that was not wisdom, but only the absence of hurry. Samuel was at the livery with Copper when he saw Farrow come in, and he recognized him from the description he'd been given in the saloon without any difficulty. He tied Copper's lead and walked out into the road. Farrow saw him at roughly the same time and pulled his horse up, and there was a moment that stretched in the way moments stretched in that kind of situation, both men making assessments, the town going quiet around them the way towns did when something was about to happen. "I'm going to ask you to ride back the way you came," Samuel said. His voice was level, not theatrical about it, just clear. "The woman you're looking for has people who'd take it poorly if you bothered her." Farrow looked at him with those flat eyes. "You must be Shelby," he said. "I heard about you. I heard you found her and went soft." "I found her and made a decision," Samuel said. "Those are different things." "Holt's going to be unhappy." "I expect so." Farrow was quiet for a moment, reading him. Samuel held completely still and waited, the way he had always been able to wait, and he was aware that Tom Ruiz had appeared in the doorway of the blacksmith shop with a hammer in his hand, and that Burl Deacon was on his porch, and that old Mr. Hennessy had gotten up from his chair, and that at least 3 other men had materialized in the general watchful way of small towns when something was pressing on them. Dusty Creek had taken Sallie Alden in. Dusty Creek was not, apparently, inclined to let her be taken out against her will. Farrow looked at Samuel and then at Ruiz with the hammer and at the line of quiet men along the road, and he was clearly doing the arithmetic that everyone in this situation had to do. "Tell Holt you couldn't find her," Samuel said. "Tell him the trail went cold. Whatever you need to tell him. I don't particularly care what you say, only that you say it's somewhere that isn't here." There was another long moment. Then Farrow turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, not hurrying, because hurrying would have told the story wrong, but going. Samuel exhaled. Tom Ruiz came out with the hammer still in his hand and stood beside him. "Friend of yours," he said. "Not remotely," Samuel said. That evening Sallie found him at the livery where he was brushing Copper with the kind of focused attention that was as much about settling his own mind as caring for the horse, and she stood in the open door with the late light behind her and said, "I heard what happened." "It wasn't much," he said. "It was something," she said. "Farrow leaving is something. It means Carlyle will have to make another decision about how to pursue this." She leaned against the door frame. "It also means you've firmly chosen a side in this. I had firmly chosen a side several days ago, he said. It just became more visible today. She was quiet, watching him work. Why? She said. He stopped brushing and looked at her. Because you're worth choosing a side for, he said. It was plain and direct, and he said it without decoration because it was the truth, and the truth, in his experience, needed no decoration. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she came into the livery and stood beside him and ran her hand along Copper's neck, and the horse turned his head toward her with an interest that horses showed when they felt comfort in a person. He likes you, Samuel said. Horses are honest, she said. I have always found that to be a relief. They stood together with the horse between them and the light going gold and slow, and something settled between them that was not yet a declaration, but was already considerably more than friendship. In the days that followed, the feeling grew in the gradual and unstoppable way that things grow in spring, quietly and at their own pace, and without asking anyone's permission. Samuel began to help Dr. Price more formally, accompanying Sallie on calls to the outlying ranches when Price was otherwise occupied, riding beside her through the desert that was in full spring bloom now, the saguaros throwing out their white flowers at the tops of their tall arms, the prickly pear burning yellow and orange, the whole landscape doing what the desert did in April, which was remind you that beauty was not the exclusive property of easier places. He watched her work. She was very good at it. She was steady with frightened children and patient with difficult adults, and she had the specific quality that the best healers had, which was the ability to be present with suffering without being defeated by it. She carried it with her, but it did not sink her. She treated a ranch hand named Pete Ortega for a broken arm from a horse fall, and the way she said it, the precision and the steadiness of her hands while Pete made his feelings known in considerable volume, made Samuel think that she had been born to this work and had been lucky enough to find it. He told her so, riding back in the late afternoon with the shadows long and blue across the desert floor. Estrella used to say that healing finds its own people, she said, that there are people who can do it and people who cannot, and the difference is not training entirely, it's something that either lives in you or doesn't. She paused. I used to wonder if she was right or if that was a kind of romantic notion. I've decided she was right. She was right, Samuel said. Sallie glanced at him. You've seen enough of people to be certain of it. Enough, he said, and I've seen you. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the road ahead, but the corner of her mouth moved. On a Thursday, 11 days after Samuel had arrived in Dusty Creek, they were sitting on the step in the evening when Sallie said, "Tell me what you actually want, not what you do, what you want." It was the kind of question that most people spent their whole lives successfully avoiding, and Samuel found that he did not want to avoid it, which itself was information. "I want to stop moving," he said slowly. "I've been moving since I was 20 years old, and I've told myself it suited me, that I was built for it, for the riding and the finding and the moving on. And that's been partly true, but it's been partly a story I told myself because I didn't have anything to stay for." He was quiet for a moment. "I want a place that's mine. I want work that builds something instead of just retrieving it." He paused. "I want to wake up and know the person in the next room and have that knowing be a good thing." The night was very still around them. The stars were extravagant, the way stars were in the desert, filling the sky without apology. "I have been," Sallie said carefully, "in the habit of not wanting things too loudly. Wanting things too loudly in the house of Carlisle Holt had consequences. So I learned to keep what I wanted quiet and small and internal." She looked up at the stars. "But I have wanted this. A place to work. A place to stay. The right to make my own decisions about my own life." She paused. "I've been afraid to add to that list because the longer the list, the more there is to lose." "I know," he said. "But if I were to add to it," she said, and her voice was carefully steady in the way that voices are when they're carrying something they're afraid to drop, "I would add that I want the kind of company that makes silence comfortable. That makes the hard things lighter. That makes me feel like I am exactly the full measure of myself, not less." He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him. "I think," he said, "that I should very much like to try to be that." Her breath came out slowly. "I think," she said, "that you already are a fair portion of the time." He reached over, and she was close enough that it took no great movement, and he took her hand in his, and her fingers curled around his, and they sat like that in the dark with the stars overhead and the desert breathing around them and the small sounds of the town settling toward sleep. And something that had been building since the morning, he stood at her door, and lost his memory of who had sent him completed itself quietly, without ceremony, in the simple, honest joining of their hands. He kissed her 3 days later, and it was not an impulsive thing but a deliberate and tender one, at the end of a long day that had involved a difficult situation at the Garrett Ranch, where their older son had been badly cut by a piece of fencing, and they had ridden there together, and she had cleaned and stitched the wound with competent speed, while Samuel held a lamp and kept the boy as calm as a 14-year-old with 9 stitches in his forearm could reasonably be expected to be. And they rode home in the dark with both of them tired and the satisfaction of a necessary thing done well. And when they reached the gate of the doctor's house, she slipped down from her horse and he came. Around and without planning it precisely, he put his hands on either side of her face and she looked up at him and neither of them said anything, and he kissed her and she kissed him back, and it was exactly as honest and warm and real as everything else between them had been. "I have been wanting to do that," he said quietly, "since approximately the 3rd evening on the step." "I know," she said. "I've been watching you want to." "Was that unkind of you?" "It was practical," she said, but she was smiling. "I needed to be sure, and I'm sure," she said. Now, beneath the satisfaction and the warmth of what was growing between them, there remained the practical and pressing matter of Carlyle Holt, who was not the kind of man to accept being denied. Samuel had turned Pharaoh away, but Pharaoh had presumably reported back to Tucson, and Carlyle now knew 2 things: that Sallie had been found, and that the man he'd paid to bring her back had instead taken her side. That was the kind of situation that tended to escalate. Samuel wrote a letter, the composition of which took him the better part of an evening at Mrs. Callahan's kitchen table. He wrote to an attorney in Tucson named Morton Beale, whom he had known for 3 years and trusted to be honest and discreet. He explained the situation plainly, that a young woman had legally ended an engagement, that she had every right to do so under the law of the Arizona Territory, that she had established herself in a new community and was causing harm to no one, and that any attempt to compel her return by physical or legal means was without foundation. He asked Beale to put this in formal language and send it to the Holt family's legal representation. He also wrote a personal letter to Carlyle Holt, which was shorter and more direct. He wrote that he had found the woman he had been contracted to find, that upon locating her, he had assessed the situation and found the terms of the contract to be ones he could not in conscience fulfill, that he was returning the advance payment by bank draft herein enclosed, and that any further pursuit of the matter would be considered a matter for legal authority. He wrote it with the careful, measured language of a man who is keeping his anger for private and not public expression. Sallie read both letters. "He won't like the formal one," she said. "No, the personal one may make him angry enough to do something rash. I'm counting on the formal one arriving first," he said. Beale is efficient, and Holt is too careful of his public reputation to do anything that would put him in open legal jeopardy. His power is built on the appearance of respectability. She thought about it. "You may be right. I may be," he said. "I'm also going to talk to the sheriff." The sheriff of the nearest incorporated county was a man named Dan Arbuckle, whose office was in a larger town called Red Mesa 15 miles east. Samuel rode there the next morning, spent an hour with Arbuckle, who was a fair-minded man with reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose and a clear grasp of his jurisdiction and its limits. Samuel explained the situation, and Arbuckle said that if Holt attempted any further interference with the woman, he would have cause to involve the territorial marshal's office, and that he would, moreover, make that known to Holt's attorneys if asked. It was not a guarantee. Nothing in the territory was a guarantee, but it was a significant addition to the wall of consequence that Samuel was building between Sallie and the man who believed he still had a claim on her. He rode back to Dusty Creek in the late afternoon and found Sallie in the yard behind the doctor's house, standing at the pump and looking south with a stillness that told him she was thinking about something difficult. "He'll stop," Samuel said, coming through the gate. She turned. "You can't know that. I know the kind of man he is well enough. A man who uses power through system and appearance and the arrangement of things. He retreats when the system stops working in his favor. He doesn't take personal risks. He doesn't come himself. He stopped in front of her. He'll send someone else eventually when he thinks the moment is right, but the letters and Arbuckle will make him cautious. And cautious becomes delay, and delay becomes something else." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to believe that." "Believe it," he said, "and in the meantime we'll be alert." She looked at him with those amber-flecked eyes. "You said we." "I did." "Are you staying then?" She asked it carefully, the way she asked everything important. "If you'll have me," he said. "Not to protect you. You don't require a protector. But because I'd rather be here than anywhere else I can think of, and because I believe, if you're willing, that there is something between us worth building." She was quiet for a long moment, and then she stepped forward and put her hand flat on his chest, over his heart, and he covered her hand with his. "I'm willing," she said. He stayed. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Samuel could recall having in a very long time, and he catalogued them with the same methodical attention he had always given to things he valued, which was to say, he paid close attention and held nothing in reserve. He made himself genuinely useful in Dusty Creek in ways that had nothing to do with his skills as a tracker. He helped Ruiz at the blacksmith shop with increasing regularity, and found that he was good with metal, which he had not particularly known before. And Ruiz, who was a man of considerable skill and limited conversation but deep good nature, began to teach him things about the work that Samuel absorbed with the focus he gave to anything he decided was worth understanding. He learned that he enjoyed making things that were solid and lasting: a shoe for a horse, a hinge for a gate, the satisfaction of a thing done with physical exactness and having it hold. Dr. Price offered him a small monthly arrangement to act as the practice's driver and occasional assistant on outlying calls, which meant regular work and regular presence near Sallie, both of which suited him. He moved from Mrs. Callahan's boarding house into a small room at the back of the livery that old Harper, who owned it, let him use for a modest sum in exchange for helping with the horses in the early mornings. It was not luxurious. It was a clean room with a cot and a nail on the wall for his coat, and a window that faced east so the morning light came in. He found it entirely satisfactory. He and Sallie were together in the way of people in a small town in 1882, which meant with full visibility, and with the particular kind of public acknowledgement that small communities gave to these things, people adjusting their behavior slightly, making small room for two people rather than one, speaking to them as a pair without making a production of it. There was a genuine tenderness in how the town held it, Samuel thought. These were people who lived hard and worked hard and valued real things, and real things between real people were recognized and respected without ceremony. He walked her home every evening. They ate together most nights, usually at the doctor's house, and Price would join them when he was not otherwise occupied, and the three of them would talk about the day and about books. Price had an excellent and eclectic library for the frontier, and about the news when the papers came through, which was the Arizona Daily Star when the stage was running reliably, and about the territory and its enormous and complicated life. One evening in May, with the heat beginning to build toward summer and the evenings still bearable, Price asked Samuel directly what his intentions were, in the direct way that older men in that era asked such questions, not unkindly but plainly. Samuel said his intentions were serious and honest and that he hoped to marry Sallie if she would agree to it, and that he was waiting for the right moment to ask her properly. Price looked at him over his coffee. "The right moment, in my experience," he said, "is the moment when you've thought about it clearly enough to mean it entirely. That moment, from what I can see, has already passed." Samuel smiled slightly. "I believe you're right." "Then I'd suggest not overthinking the logistics," Price said. He asked her the following Sunday, which was the third Sunday in May, 1882, on a morning that was clear and warm with a light wind coming in from the west smelling of distant rain that probably would not arrive until later. They had ridden out together early, a habit they had developed on Sundays when the doctor's practice was quiet, riding out into the desert for an hour or two with no destination, just the horses and the space and the enormous sky. They had stopped at a low red rock formation that caught the morning light on its flat top surfaces and glowed the color of something molten. They had climbed down from their horses and sat on the warm rock with the desert spread below and around them, the saguaros and the low scrub, and somewhere in the distance, the thin silver line of what might have been a dry creek bed catching the light at a certain angle. He did not make a speech. He said, "Sally, I would like to spend my life alongside you if you'll have me. I think we are good for each other, and I think we are good together, and I think the life we could build would be a real and worthwhile one. I know the circumstances of how we met were unusual, and I know you've had cause not to trust men's intentions, and I want to say plainly that mine are clean and entire. I love you." He had not said that last part before. The words came out with a simplicity that surprised him, the way true things sometimes do. She was looking at him and her eyes were very bright, and she said, "I love you too. I have been somewhat alarmed by how quickly I have arrived at that, but there it is." She paused. "Yes, Samuel, I'll marry you." He took her face in his hands and kissed her on the warm red rock with the desert all around them and the horses grazing peacefully behind them. And the morning felt like something complete and beginning at the same time. They were married in the tilting white church in Dusty Creek on a Saturday at the end of June, 6 weeks after he had asked her on the Red Rock. It was not an elaborate affair, because neither of them were inclined to elaborate affairs, but it was genuine in the way that mattered. Dr. Price walked her down the short aisle because he was the nearest thing to a father figure she had in the territory, and he did it with a solemnity and a quiet pride that made at least 3 people in the small congregation find it necessary to look at their boots for a moment. The minister was a young man named Fellows who stammered slightly when nervous, but whose voice went clear and warm when he was reading scripture, and who had the good sense to keep his remarks brief and sincere. Burl Deacon was there, and Tom Ruiz and his wife Clara, and old Mr. Hennessy, who fell asleep during the ceremony but woke up for the reception with apparently no loss of continuity, and the Beaumont family with their children, and Pete Ortega, the ranch hand whose arm Sally had set, who wore a clean shirt that was too small across the shoulders and looked very proud of having found it. Sally wore a dress that Clara Ruiz had helped her make, a deep blue that was neither bridal white nor everyday drab, but something that was entirely her own, and her hair was pinned with a small spray of desert flowers that she had gathered that morning. And she was more beautiful than Samuel had words for, which he told her at the end of the evening, and which made her laugh and take his hand. The reception was held in the yard behind the general store, which Burl had swept and strung with lanterns that swayed in the evening air, and someone had produced a fiddle, and someone else a small squeeze box, and there was dancing on the packed earth under the lantern light, clumsy and enthusiastic, and joyful in the way that dancing was in places where people worked very hard and did not take their celebrations for granted. He danced with her badly, and she did not mind or pretended not to mind, and they danced and then stood together at the edge of the light with a cup of punch each, watching the others, and he felt something settle in him that he had not known was unsettled, a deep and final coming to rest, like a river finding its bed. The letter from Morton Beale arrived 2 weeks after the wedding. It was brief and carried good news. Carlisle Holt, faced with formal legal correspondence regarding the right of adult women to terminate engagements and the protections available under territorial law, and advised by his own attorneys that any further pursuit of the matter was likely to result in legal proceedings that would be unflattering to his public reputation, had indicated through his representatives that he would not pursue the matter further. He had not apologized. Beale had not expected him to. But the disengagement was clear and documented, and Beale was confident it would hold. Samuel read the letter to Sallie at the kitchen table. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Is it over?" "Yes," he said. "As over as these things get." She nodded slowly. There was a complicated expression on her face, the particular expression of someone processing the end of a long-held tension, not quite relief, something more complex, the acknowledgement that fear had been a companion for a long time and its departure left a space. "Good," she said finally, and then she straightened her shoulders in that way she had and looked at him with clear eyes. "Then we can stop looking south over our shoulders and look at what's in front of us." "Yes," he said, "I'd very much like that." What was in front of them was considerable, and they set about it with the focused and happy industry of two people who have decided what they want and have the energy and intention to build it. Samuel formalized his arrangement with Tom Ruiz at the blacksmith shop, becoming a proper partner in the enterprise, which meant investing money he had saved over years of work and which had been sitting in the merchant's bank in Tucson doing little of use. Ruiz's small operation became Ruiz and Shelby, and the sign outside the blacksmith shop was repainted accordingly, and the work expanded because Samuel had the connections from years of traveling the territory that brought in contracts for tools and hardware from ranches and the copper operation, and eventually a small regular arrangement with the Army post 20 miles north. He liked the work more each month. He liked making things that lasted. Sallie continued with Dr. Price, whose health was beginning to slow him slightly. He had a persistent cough that worried her and which she watched carefully, and whose practice she had effectively become a full partner in, handling the majority of the general calls and the nursing while Price kept the more complex surgical work and the medications. There were letters she had begun to write, carefully and with determination, to the Territorial Medical Administration in Phoenix, making the case that trained nurses should have recognized formal status in small settlements without resident physicians, that the work was critical and the practitioners competent, and that the law should reflect this. It was a slow and largely thankless process of correspondence, but she pursued it because it was right, and because Estrella and women like her had never received the recognition their knowledge deserved, and Sallie intended to change that in whatever small way she could reach. They moved into a small house that had been empty on the near side of town, a adobe structure with thick walls that kept the summer heat somewhat at bay, and a front room and a back room, and a kitchen and a yard that was wild with neglect, and which Sallie began to cultivate with an attention and enthusiasm that surprised Samuel until he thought about it and realized it should not surprise him at all. She grew tomatoes and squash and a bed of herbs for the medical work, and she put in a small patch of flowers entirely for beauty, a deliberate and defiant act, beauty as a thing worth tending. He built her a proper fence for the yard over 2 weekends in September, with a gate that swung true and a post at each corner that was sunk deep enough to survive the winter winds, and she stood back and looked at it with her hands on her hips and said it was the finest fence she had ever seen, which he knew was not strictly accurate but appreciated entirely. In the autumn of 1882, 2 things happened that were worth recording. The first was that Dr. Price, in a conversation with Samuel and Sallie together at the kitchen table one evening in October, told them that he had been corresponding with a medical school in Philadelphia, and that he intended, in the following spring, to go back east for a period of time to consult with colleagues and to rest, which he had been told repeatedly by Sallie he needed to do. He said it in a way that was both firm and a little wistful, And he said also that he trusted Sallie entirely to maintain the practice in his absence, and that he had made provisions for a formal arrangement with the county regarding her authority while he was gone. Sallie received this news with a composure that lasted until Price had said good night and gone to bed, at which point she sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and breathed carefully. "You all right?" Samuel asked. "I am terrified," she said, "and very glad." "Both of those seem appropriate," he said. The second thing that happened in October was that Sallie, after a morning of quiet certainty that she kept to herself until she was sure, told Samuel that she was expecting a child. He was standing by the wood stove when she told him, and he turned and looked at her for a moment that held everything, and then he crossed the room and put his arms around her with a gentleness that was also entire, the way a careful, strong thing is both careful and strong at the same time, and she pressed her face against his shoulder. "A child," he said. "Yes." "When?" "Spring," she said. "March or April." He held her for a long moment without speaking, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window and fell across the scrubbed table and the herbs in their jars on the shelf. And outside the yard was brown and settled in autumn. And the house around them was theirs, and the life in it was theirs, and the child coming was theirs. And Samuel thought that he had spent 8 years of his life moving and finding and returning things that belonged elsewhere. And now he had found the only thing that had ever truly belonged to him, which was this woman, this house, this life, this beginning. "I love you," he said, which he had now been saying for months and which still felt precise and new each time. "I love you too," she said, "and I am very glad you could not remember who sent you." He laughed, which surprised them both, and she laughed too, and they stood in the kitchen laughing at the particular absurdity of it. The man paid to find her who could not remember the name of the man who had paid him, and how that single, inexplicable blank in his memory had changed everything. Winter came to Dusty Creek with the particular desert version of cold, which was not the deep cold of the northern territories but was sharp and real enough, the nights dropping hard and the days bright and clear as glass. Samuel stacked wood against the side of the house with a thoroughness that Sallie called excessive, and that proved precisely right when a cold snap in January dropped the temperature below what the territory had seen in several years. He kept the wood stove burning steady, and she kept the herb jars on the kitchen shelf, and they learned the intimate particular rhythms of a winter shared, who woke earliest and who was slow in the morning, and who needed silence with coffee, and who could talk freely from the moment their eyes were open, and which of them could hear a loose board in the night, and which of them could sleep through anything. She was a quiet waker, clear-headed immediately, sitting up and looking at the room as though she had been awake already somewhere behind her eyes. He was slow and warm and needed approximately 12 minutes and a hot cup before he was fully arrived in the day. She found this amusing and kind-hearted and made the coffee every morning, a small daily act of consideration that he received with gratitude and returned in other ways, by bringing in the wood and by taking the cold early rides when medical calls came before dawn. When the cold snap hit, there were 3 families on outlying ranches who were in difficult situations with illness, and Samuel rode out to them with supplies and messages, and the general reassurance of a capable man arriving in hard conditions, while Sallie managed the medical aspects from the house, sending notes and medicines with him, and receiving updates and adjusting instructions accordingly, the two of them working as a unit that was both effective and natural. Like a team of well-matched horses that had been working together long enough to need no direction. In February, a letter came from Sallie's sister in Albuquerque. Her name was Pearl, and she wrote with warmth and relief that Sallie was safe and well and married, and that she and her husband James intended to visit in the spring, if the roads permitted, and if timing could be arranged around the expected baby. Sallie read the letter at the kitchen table with a brightness in her eyes that was not tears but was close to them, and she wrote back by return stage with a fullness and joy that Samuel read over her shoulder with one hand resting lightly on her back. March arrived with the first warm edges in the air, and with Sallie moving carefully, and with the particular beauty that some women carry in pregnancy, a fullness and presence, a gravity of being that was remarkable to watch in someone who had always moved with such intention. Dr. Price, who had delayed his Eastern trip to be present for the birth, monitored her with meticulous care and pronounced everything progressing exactly as it should. Pearl and James Whitmore arrived in the second week of March, having come by stage from Albuquerque with a baby daughter of their own, 18 months old and named Rose, who had Pearl's dark eyes and absolutely no tolerance for being still. The house was suddenly considerably fuller than it had been designed to accommodate, which caused a brief logistical negotiation that Sallie managed with the same composure she managed everything, and which resulted in Pearl and James and Rose at Mrs. Callahan's, where the biscuits were excellent, and Pearl at the house from morning through evening every day. Samuel watched the two sisters together and understood something about Sallie that he had not entirely understood before. Pearl was warm where Sallie was contained, expansive where Sallie was precise, and they were completely complementary, each one evidently having shaped the other in ways that were visible now that they were together. He liked Pearl enormously, and James was a quiet, solid man who worked in a printer's shop and who told good stories and played cards without cheating, both of which Samuel considered excellent qualities. On the night of March 29th, which was a Thursday, the baby came. It was a harder delivery than Price would have wished, and he worked through it with the focus and experience of his years, and with Sallie's absolute extraordinary calm that did not leave her even in the worst of it, and Pearl held her sister's hand through the long hours of it. And at 3:15 in the morning, a boy came into the world with a voice that could apparently be heard at the end of the road. Samuel, who had been sitting in the front room with James for several hours in the specific silent agony of men who are excluded from the important work by biology and tradition, heard the cry and stood up, and James stood too, and they looked at each other. And the door opened, and Dr. Price came out with a look of profound relief on his tired face and said, "A boy. Both of them are well." Samuel sat down again suddenly, which was not exactly the response he had expected to have. He sat down on the chair and pressed his hands against his face for a moment, and James put a hand on his shoulder and did not say anything, because the moment did not require anything said. When they let him in, Sallie was propped against the pillows with the color coming back to her face and her hair loose and damp, and she looked at him with those amber-flecked eyes, and there was in her expression a profound tiredness and a happiness that was not separate from the tiredness but ran through it like a current. And she was holding the boy. He was very small and very definite, already looking at the world with an expression of demanding assessment that Samuel would later say he recognized immediately. "Hello," Samuel said, and he did not know if he was saying it to the baby or to Sallie or to the whole transformed room, but it seemed to serve for all of them. "Come and see your son," Sallie said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the boy in his arms, and he held him with the careful reverence of someone holding something that is both extraordinary and extraordinarily fragile, and the boy looked up at him with the blurred, unfocused focus of the very new, and Samuel thought about the man he had been in April, riding into this town on copper with a folded piece of paper, and a job he did not entirely believe in, and about the specific and impossible grace of the memory that had not come when he reached for it, the name that had slipped from him on a front doorstep and given him a choice that had led here, to this room and this woman and this child. "What do we call him?" he asked. "I thought," Sallie said, "that if it was a boy we might call him Harlan after the doctor." She paused, with Samuel as the middle. He looked at her. "That is a good name," he said. "I thought so," she said, and she leaned her head back against the pillow and closed her eyes for a moment. And he sat with the boy in his arms and the lamp burning low and the Arizona night outside going slowly toward dawn, and peace was not a big enough word for what was in the room, but it was the nearest word there was. Dr. Price, when told the name they had chosen, removed his glasses and polished them with great deliberation and put them back on, and said that he was very pleased, which was a significant understatement given that his eyes were considerably brighter than usual. He left for the East 2 weeks after the birth, having satisfied himself that both mother and son were in excellent health, and having spent an afternoon with Samuel going through every practical detail of the practice that Sallie would need, though Sallie herself had already mastered most of them. He shook Samuel's hand at the stage depot with a firmness that communicated several things, and he embraced Sallie briefly, which was unusual for his habitual restraint, and he looked at the baby one more time and then climbed onto the stage and was carried away down the road toward Red Mesa and beyond. Sallie stood watching the stage go with the baby in her arms and Samuel beside her, and she said, "He'll be all right." "I think so," Samuel said. "He's gone east to rest, but also to see something new," she said. "He's been in this territory for 20 years. I think he needed to look at a different horizon." "When he comes back," Samuel said, "if he comes back, the practice will be here and so will you." She looked at him. "Do you think he'll come back?" "I think," Samuel said, "that Dusty Creek gets into people." She smiled. "It does," she said. "It certainly got into you." "You got into me," he said, which was both the correction and the truth. Pearl and James and Rose went back to Albuquerque in early April, with promises of return and a standing invitation in both directions. And Sallie held Rose one last time in the doorway of the house, and said something quiet into the child's ear that made Pearl look at her with a bright expression. And then they were gone, and the house was quiet again, with only Harlan Samuel Shelby making himself known in the particular confident way he had, and the yard coming up green with the spring planting, and the desert in bloom outside the fence. In the months that followed, they built their life with the steady and purposeful happiness of people who know what they have and are not careless with it. The blacksmith shop expanded again in the summer, adding a third hand in the form of a young man named Felix who was 17 and had come from a ranch north of Red Mesa looking for work, and who had the useful combination of physical strength, good coordination, and an eagerness to learn that made him exactly what the shop needed. Samuel taught him with the same patience and exactness that Ruiz had taught Samuel, and Felix learned quickly and was reliable and gradually became a genuine asset. Sallie's correspondence with the Phoenix Medical Administration had, after more than a year of patient persistence, finally produced a response of substantive engagement. A territorial health official named Patterson had written to acknowledge the importance of nursing practitioners in underserved communities and to indicate that a formal certification process was being considered. It was not everything she had pushed for, but it was movement, and she wrote back immediately with a detailed proposal that she had been preparing since the first letter, as though she had known that when the moment came she would need to be ready. She was always ready. Samuel had come to understand this as fundamental to who she was, that she did not wait to be invited, she arrived prepared. Harlan grew the way children grow in their first year, which was at a rate that seemed impossible and daily. He had his mother's eyes and his father's calm temperament, with sudden moments of extreme opinion that could have come from either of them. He was introduced to Copper at 4 months old, and showed an immediate and calm interest in the horse that Copper returned in kind, lowering his large head to investigate the small person with a gentleness that made Samuel's chest ache with an almost absurd affection. By the time Harlan was walking, just after his first birthday, the house in Dusty Creek felt like a thing that had always been and would always be, fixed and warm and full, the center of a life that had been found in the most unexpected way, at the end of a job that had lost its instructions somewhere between Tucson and a front doorstep in April of 1882. Late in the fall of 1883, on a Sunday evening with the wood fire going and Harlan asleep in the back room, and the smell of coffee, and the last of the evening in the air, Samuel and Sallie were sitting together on the sofa that Clara Ruiz had helped them acquire from a family who was moving east, a solid and comfortable thing that occupied the front room with the confidence of an object that knows its place. He had his arm around her and she was leaning into him with a letter in her hand from Pearl, who was expecting a second child in the new year. "She says she wants to come back this spring," Sallie said. "Bring Rose and the new one and stay for the summer." "Good," he said. "The house can hold more than we use it for." She looked up at him. "We might need it," she said carefully. He looked down at her. "Are you telling me something?" "I am telling you something," she said. He was quiet for a moment and then he smiled, which he did not always do quickly, but when he did it was complete. It reached all the way into the gray eyes and changed them entirely. "Another spring," he said. "Another spring," she confirmed. "I should probably extend the fence," he said. She laughed, and the sound of it filled the room and went past the walls and out into the November dark. And the fire crackled and the baby slept, and the desert night was cold and enormous and full of stars. On a morning in February of 1884, Samuel was working at the blacksmith shop when old Mr. Hennessy came in looking for a replacement buckle for a piece of tack and stayed, as he generally did, to talk about various matters of civic and personal interest for considerably longer than the buckle required. He was 71 years old and had been in the Arizona Territory since before it was a territory, and he had opinions on most things and the conversational energy to share them at length. "Your wife was by the store yesterday," he said, watching Samuel at the anvil with the appreciative air of a man who enjoyed watching other people do physical work. "Talking to Burl about getting a proper medical supply order organized with the stage line. She's got plans, that woman." "She does," Samuel agreed. "Good kind of plans," Hennessy said. "The kind that make a place better than it found itself." He was quiet for a moment. "Burl says the territorial people finally wrote back with something concrete about the nursing certification." "That's right." "About time," Hennessy said, with the directness of someone who had been around long enough to know what things cost in patience and effort. "Things like that should have been settled years ago. Women doing that work in this territory, out here where there ain't a doctor in 50 miles half the time, and the law treating them like it's optional whether they have any standing, doesn't make a lick of sense." "No," Samuel said, "it doesn't." "Your wife knows that better than anyone," Hennessy said. "She's making it better, one letter at a time." Samuel set down his hammer and looked at the old man. "Yes," he said, "she is." He said it with the simple and entire pride of a man who understood exactly what he had. And Hennessy looked at him with the knowing look of a very old man who has watched enough of life to know when he is seeing the real thing. In March, exactly 2 years after Harlan's birth, the second child came, and this one was a girl, born in the same room as her brother, delivered by Dr. Price, who had returned from the East the previous autumn with a new energy and a cough that had, remarkably, cleared entirely after 6 months of Eastern rest. He had come back to Dusty Creek with new books and new ideas, and a letter of formal recognition from the Territorial Medical Board for Sallie that he presented to her, with a ceremony that he claimed was purely professional. But that involved considerably more emotion than strictly professional. The girl was born on a mild March evening with less drama than her brother, and arrived looking serene and evaluating the room with an expression of complete composure that struck everyone present as remarkably her own. They called her Clara Pearl, after Clara Ruiz, who had been a quiet and constant help to Sallie in so many practical ways, and after Pearl, who sent a letter back full of joy and told them that Rose was delighted to be a cousin to a girl. Samuel held Clara Pearl in the front room while the house settled into the easy activity of the new baby hours, the doctor and the quiet preparations, and Sallie resting with the particular exhausted satisfaction she had earned. And he thought about Samuel the tracker, the man on the roan horse riding into Dusty Creek with a name on a folded piece of paper, and a memory that would fail him at exactly the right moment. He would not say it was fate. He was too practical for that word. He would say it was luck, which he respected and was grateful for, and his own decision, which he was also grateful for. The decision to stay. The decision to choose her. The decision, before any of that, to stand on a doorstep and instead of lying smoothly, to say plainly and honestly that he could not remember the name he needed, which had started everything. Tom Ruiz looked at him once early that spring when they were walking to the shop together in the morning with their breath showing in the cold air, and said out of nowhere, "You're a different man than when you rode in here." Samuel thought about it. "No," he said. "Same man, just settled." "Like a new house," Ruiz said thoughtfully, "settles into its foundation, more solid after." "Something like that," Samuel said. The years passed in the way of years when they are good ones, which was not without difficulty, but with a fundamental sufficiency that gave the difficulties their proper proportion. There were hard winters and a drought summer that strained everyone in the territory. There was a season when the copper operations troubles with the Denver company came to a head, and 20 men were briefly out of work, and Ruiz and Shelby extended credit to the families it affected with a straightforwardness that cost them money in the short run, and returned it in loyalty and good work over the years that followed. There was a season when Harlan was 4 and got the kind of fever that made every parent in the territory afraid, and Sallie treated her own child with the same hands she used on everyone else's, which was harder than any work she had ever done. And he recovered, and in the aftermath she sat at the kitchen table and allowed herself, privately and briefly, to fall apart a little, and Samuel sat beside her and held her until she was done. Felix, the young man from the ranch north of Red Mesa, turned out to have a natural gift for ironwork that exceeded what the blacksmith shop strictly required, and by the time he was 20, he had begun producing decorative pieces alongside the utilitarian work. Hinges and brackets with a flourish in them, gates with a grace in the metalwork, small pieces of art that were also functional, and that people in the territory began to specifically request. Ruiz was enormously proud of him and said so regularly, and Felix stayed and the shop prospered and Dusty Creek grew slightly with each passing year, never becoming big, never losing the quality of a place that people chose deliberately, which was the best kind of place. Pearl and James visited twice more in those years, the second time with 3 children, Rose and a boy named Peter, and a new baby whose name was Eli. And the house was as full as it could reasonably be, and Sallie and Pearl talked through every evening until too late, and James and Samuel sat on the front step and looked at the stars with the beer that the saloon now produced from a small local operation, and said the kinds of things that men say late at night after good days when the people they love are inside and the world is, temporarily and truly, in its right order. One evening in the fall of 1886, Harlan was 3, Clara Pearl was 2, and Sallie was in the last months of a 3rd pregnancy. Samuel was sitting in the yard in the cooling air of the evening when Sallie came to the door and leaned against the frame, watching him. He had been reading a letter from Beale in Tucson that was purely social, a catch-up on various acquaintances and the news of the city, and that mentioned in passing that Carlisle Holt had married a woman from a California family 6 months prior and had moved to San Francisco to manage a business interest there. He had told Sallie this over supper, and she had received it with no particular emotion that he could read, and they had talked about other things, and now in the evening air she came to the door and looked at him. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I was thinking about something. 4 years ago I was afraid all the time. Not openly, not dramatically, just always. A low constant frequency of it, like a sound you stop noticing but that wears on you." She looked at the yard, at the flowers she had planted and the garden and the fence he had built. "I don't feel that anymore. I haven't in a long time. I think it's been gone so gradually that I didn't notice when it left." He looked at her. "Good," he said. "It's a remarkable thing," she said, "to put down something you've been carrying so long you thought it was just part of you." "Yes," he said. She came into the yard and sat beside him in the other chair, the chairs they had placed there in the spring for exactly this kind of evening, and the late light was on everything and the desert was alive with the first stars. "Tell me something," she said. "What would you like to know? Do you ever regret it, losing the job, the money you gave back?" She paused. "The way your life changed when you knocked on that door." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "not for a day, not for an hour." She held his gaze. "Not even the morning you rode in and didn't know who you were working for anymore." "Especially not that morning," he said. "That morning was the best moment of luck I have ever had, and I have thought so every day since." She reached over and took his hand in hers, her fingers familiar and warm against his palm. The stars were fully out now, the great desert sky doing what it did, filling the darkness with uncountable light. "Samuel Shelby," she said, with the warmth and the slight humor and the complete love that she had for him, and that she showed most clearly in these quiet, direct moments, "you were the strangest man I ever opened a door to." "And what did you think when you saw me?" He asked, the honest truth. She thought about it. "I thought you looked like a man who was about to say something he wasn't sure of," she said, "and that the unsure part of you was the most trustworthy thing about you." He laughed quietly. "You knew immediately." "I suspected immediately," she said. "I was sure by the third evening." The third child was born in November of 1886, another boy, and they called him James William, after Pearl's husband, who had been a good and steady presence in all their lives, and after Samuel's father, who had been a quiet Tennessee farmer of total decency and not much else, which was, Samuel had come to believe, more than enough. The boy arrived in the first cold days of November and was, from the first hours, possessed of a cheerful certainty about himself and his place in the world that would characterize him for the rest of his life. Harlan, age 3, received his brother with a seriousness of purpose that suggested he had been thinking about the responsibilities of a firstborn and was prepared to take them on. Clara Pearl, age 2, was indifferent to James William for approximately a week and then became ferociously devoted, which was how she would always be, her affections slow to arrive and then total once they did. The house was full and the yard was full, and the shop was doing well, and the medical practice was doing well, and the certification that Sallie had pushed for had finally come through in the early part of that year. A territorial recognition of nursing practitioners that was small and still incomplete, but was something real, and was going to make a difference to women doing this work across the territory, which was its point. Price celebrated this by ordering a bottle of the most expensive whiskey available through the general store, which arrived on the stage 3 weeks later, and he and Samuel and Sallie drank it at the kitchen table on a Friday evening with Harlan asleep on the sofa and Clara Pearl and James William in their beds, and Price raised his glass and said, "To the work, and to the woman who does it." Samuel raised his glass and looked at Sallie, and she looked at him with those amber-flecked eyes, warm and direct, and his, entirely and completely his, as he was entirely and completely hers. "To the work," he said, "and to Sallie." She shook her head slightly as though the attention were slightly excessive, and then she raised her own glass and said, "To what's in front of us." They drank, and the night was around them, and the children were sleeping, and the fire was warm, and the life they had built together was solid under them and above them and in every direction, and there was nowhere else either of them would have been, nowhere in the world or in any imagining of it, because this was it, the thing you looked for without knowing you were looking for it, the place you arrived at by the strangest and most unrepeatable of roads. A folded piece of paper and a 4-day ride, and a blank space in a memory that had somehow, against all reason, been exactly the grace that was needed. In the spring of 1887, Copper, the roan horse who had carried Samuel into Dusty Creek on that April morning 5 years before, was 30 by the vet's careful estimation, an old age for a horse, and he spent his days in the good pasture behind the livery that Harper had expanded, and Harlan, who was 4 and tall for it, was allowed to help bring Copper his oats in the morning under Samuel's supervision. The small boy and the old horse regarding each other with a mutual solemnity that Samuel found deeply affecting. Copper died on a warm evening in May, in the pasture peacefully, as the good ones go, and Samuel was with him and stayed until it was finished, and then rode back to the house on one of the livery horses, and Sallie met him at the door, knowing already from the look of him. And she took his face in her hands the way he had once taken hers, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say, and he leaned his forehead against hers, and they stood in the doorway for a moment. And then Harlan came running from the back room and wrapped himself around Samuel's leg, with the completeness of small children who understand very little about grief, but know exactly what comfort looks like and offer it. Immediately and without reservation, he buried Copper in the pasture with Harper's blessing and put up a marker, a small flat stone with the horse's name cut into it, which Felix made with a care that was above and beyond any practical requirement, the letters deep and clean, and the edges of the stone smoothed and precise, a piece of work done with affection. The marker stood in the pasture at the edge of Dusty Creek, in the Arizona Territory, in the year 1887, and the desert grew up around it slowly as it grew around everything, patient and indifferent and wildly beautiful. And the town went on growing, and the practice went on, and the shop went on, and the children grew. Harlan Samuel Shelby grew up steady and curious, with his father's watchful eyes and his mother's directness, and he learned to read early and well. And at 7, he could name every desert plant within walking distance of the town and its medicinal properties, having absorbed this from Sallie, the way children absorb the things that live in their world from the very beginning. Clara Pearl grew up fierce and precise and musical, discovering that she had a singing voice of unusual quality and power that she deployed without self-consciousness and with considerable effect. She sang in the church that had been re-leveled and no longer tilted, and she sang on the step in the evenings, and she sang to her brothers when they were sick, and the town regarded her talent as a particular asset of the place, which she received with the same composure with which she received most things. James William grew up cheerful and social and good with horses and with people, with the kind of easy warmth that made everyone like him immediately, and that, as he grew, he would learn to pair with a genuine and reliable kindness that made the warmth more than just charm. There would be, in later years, a 4th child, born in 1889, a girl they named Estelle, after Estrella, who had taught Sallie everything that first woman had known about healing, and whose knowledge and tradition deserved a name carried forward. But that was later. In the spring of 1887, in the house on the near side of Dusty Creek, with the yard in bloom and the children growing, and the desert doing its annual impossible transformation into color and light, Samuel and Sallie Shelby were sitting on the front step in the evening, an old habit that they had never given up, the step where they had first been honest with each other and had built everything that came after from that honesty as a foundation. The stars came out. "Tell me what you want," he said, which was a game they had started playing, this asking of the question she had once asked him, the question that was the opposite of taking things for granted. She leaned back against his arm and looked at the sky. "I want," she said, "exactly this and whatever is next." "And what do you think is next?" "Everything," she said. "Everything that belongs to a life lived entirely forward." She turned to look at him. "What about you?" "I want," he said, and he meant all of it, the house and the shop and the children and the practice and the town and the woman beside him and the stars and the desert and the years ahead of them, exactly what I have. She put her head against his shoulder and he felt her exhale slowly, and the evening held them both in it, easy and complete. The man who had ridden into Dusty Creek in the spring of 1882 with someone else's job in his breast pocket and a name on a folded piece of paper had lost something at a front door. A name, a commission, the threadbare thread of who he was supposed to be working for, and in losing it had found the only thing that had ever truly needed finding, which was not a person to be returned to somewhere else but a life to be built here, now, in this place and this time. With this woman and these children and these wide open acres of desert and sky, he had been paid to find her and bring her back quietly. He had found her. He could not remember who had sent him, and he had spent every day since being grateful for that precise and particular mercy.